The paper cup on the metal table was sweating. I watched a single drop of condensation slide down the wax coating, pool at the base, and soak into the cheap wood veneer. Detective Tobias sat across from me, his thumbs methodically rubbing the edges of a plastic evidence folder. He did not look like a man who cared about antique jewelry, provenance, or family legacy. He looked like a man who cared about wire fraud, interstate commerce, and the federal penal code. He slid a photocopy across the table. It was a standard appraisal form, the kind my firm, Oak Haven Antiquities, issued dozens of times a month. The letterhead was ours, the signature at the bottom was mine. It was dated 12 years ago. Tobias asked me, in a voice completely devoid of inflection, if I could verify that the sapphire pendant described in the document was authentic, and if I stood by the valuation of $400,000. I looked at the photocopy, then at the grey walls of the interrogation room, and realized that the trap I had built for myself more than a decade ago had finally snapped shut. To understand how I ended up sitting in a municipal police station on a Tuesday morning, you have to understand the architecture of my family's delusion. We lived in a coastal Massachusetts town where reputation was a currency that outlasted actual money by about 3 generations. My mother, Eleanor, resided in a 19-room Victorian estate that was slowly sinking into the marshland. The roof leaked, the heating system was a gamble, and the property taxes were in a state of perpetual delinquency. Yet, Eleanor maintained the posture of a reigning monarch. She hosted charity committees in a parlor where the silk wallpaper was peeling, pouring cheap sherry into baccarat crystal, pretending the structural decay around her was simply a charming patina. I was the eldest daughter, the pragmatist, the one who moved out at 22, got a degree in historical archiving, and built a quiet, stable life assessing other people's discarded treasures. My sister Darcy was the opposite. 10 years younger, she was the family's designated visionary. Darcy never just had a job. She had startups, lifestyle brands, and venture concepts that required massive infusions of capital and inevitably dissolved into bankruptcy within a year. Eleanor constantly bailed her out, liquidating whatever minor assets the family had left. The only thing Eleanor refused to sell was the Vance sapphire. It was a massive deep blue stone set in a platinum and diamond filigree, supposedly acquired by our great-grandfather in London just after the turn of the century. It was the physical manifestation of the family's surviving dignity. It was also a complete fabrication. When I was 28 and just starting my appraisal business, Eleanor brought the necklace to my apartment. She was in a state of quiet panic. The bank was threatening foreclosure on the estate, and she needed a line of credit. She asked me to write an official appraisal for the sapphire so she could use it as collateral. I took the piece to my lab, put it under the microscope, and found what I had always suspected. The stone was a Verneuil synthetic sapphire. It was a beautiful, mathematically perfect crystal grown in a laboratory, likely manufactured around 1928. The setting was genuine platinum, and the accent diamonds were real, but the center stone was worthless on the antiquities market. Our grandfather had likely sold the real sapphire during the Depression and commissioned a high-quality replica to save face. When I told Eleanor, she simply refused to hear it. She looked at me with a cold, terrifying emptiness and told me I was mistaken, that I was inexperienced, and that if I did not write the appraisal, she would lose the house and take her own life. It was not a dramatic threat. It was stated as a matter of logistical fact. So I compromised my ethics, my profession, and my own boundaries. I wrote an appraisal carefully omitting the word synthetic. I valued it based on the assumption of natural origin. Eleanor got her line of credit, paid the back taxes, and the necklace went back into the floor safe under the library desk. For 12 years, I lived with the low-grade anxiety of a fraudster. The tension finally broke 2 nights ago during my 40th birthday dinner. Eleanor had insisted on hosting it at the estate. I hated these gatherings, characterized by cold roast lamb, passive-aggressive comments about my unmarried status, and the overwhelming smell of damp plaster. Yasmin, my business partner, had accompanied me as a buffer. Yasmin was a sharp, uncompromising woman who managed the financial side of our firm and had zero tolerance for Eleanor's aristocratic theater. Halfway through the dinner, Darcy announced she had finally found the perfect business opportunity. It was a boutique wellness retreat in upstate New York. She just needed $250,000 to secure the commercial lease. I kept my eyes on my plate, expecting Eleanor to deliver her usual speech about liquidity issues. Instead, Eleanor stood up, walked to the antique sideboard, and brought out a faded velvet box. She placed it in front of Darcy. She said it was time the family legacy served the future. She was giving Darcy the sapphire, not lending it, giving it. I stopped chewing. I looked at Eleanor, waiting for the punchline. She knew the necklace was a replica. She knew the appraisal I wrote was a fiction designed strictly to appease a local credit union 12 years ago. But as I watched Darcy open the box and gasp at the synthetic blue stone, I realized Eleanor had spent the last decade convincing herself the lie was true. She had rewritten history in her own mind to survive the humiliation of our poverty. Darcy immediately started talking about leverage. She knew a private equity group in Boston that offered rapid collateralized loans for high-net-worth individuals. She said she was driving down the next morning to hand over the piece and get the funding. I should have stopped it right there. I should have stood up, pointed at the necklace, and told the table it was glass. But I was exhausted. I was tired of managing their crises, tired of being the anchor in a storm they continuously summoned. Our dark, vindictive part of me decided to let it happen. Let Darcy take a piece of synthetic spinel to a Boston financier. Let their appraisers laugh her out of the building. It would be humiliating, but it would finally burst the bubble of delusion they lived in. I said nothing. I finished my wine, thanked Eleanor for the dinner, and went home. I did not anticipate that the private equity group Darcy had contacted was currently the target of a massive federal investigation for money laundering and predatory lending practices. I did not know that they did not bother appraising collateral, because they intended to seize the underlying assets anyway. And I certainly did not know that when the authorities raided the firm's Boston offices the following afternoon, they would find my forged appraisal attached to a fraudulent loan application signed by my sister. That is why Detective Tobias was waiting at Darcy's door the next morning. That is why they were freezing the estate's bank accounts. And that is why I was now sitting in the police station, staring at my own signature. Tobias tapped the paper. He explained that Darcy had used the necklace and the appraisal to secure a $300,000 bridge loan. Because the loan crossed state lines and involved an institution under federal scrutiny, the inflated collateral was being treated as active wire fraud. Darcy was facing serious prison time. Furthermore, because Eleanor had co-signed the loan using the estate as secondary collateral, the government was moving to seize the house under civil forfeiture laws. The only way out for Darcy, Tobias explained, was if she had genuinely believed the item was worth what the paper said. But if I, the expert, confessed that I had knowingly provided a fraudulent document to inflate her collateral, I would be indicted alongside her as a co-conspirator. I looked at Tobias. He was not a cruel man, but he was thorough. He was waiting for me to crack to start crying or to throw my sister under the bus. I asked for 24 hours to retrieve my original case notes from my office. I told him I needed to review the spectral analysis from 12 years ago to confirm the stone's origin before making an official statement. He agreed, but kept my passport and told me not to leave the county. I walked out of the municipal building into the damp afternoon air. My phone was vibrating continuously. It was Yasmin. I answered, and she told me she was waiting in her car across the street. I got into the passenger seat, and she handed me a thermos of coffee. Yasmin did not ask if I was okay. She opened her laptop. She had spent the morning running the loan documents through her contacts in the financial sector. She told me the situation was actually worse than the police realized. The federal prosecutors were looking for an easy win. They wanted to nail the lending firm, and proving the firm accepted obviously fraudulent collateral helped build their case for reckless underwriting. They needed the necklace to be fake, and they needed me to admit I faked the appraisal, thereby proving the lenders were complicit in accepting bad paper. Yasmin looked at me. She had been digging through our firm's digital archives. She found the folder from 12 years ago. She saw the deleted drafts where I had noted the microscopic curved striae, the definitive proof of a Verneuil synthetic. She asked me why I did it. I told her the truth. I was 28, terrified, and trying to keep my mother from falling apart. Yasmin closed the laptop. She said we had to go to the estate. We needed to find a way to prove that Darcy and Eleanor were legally incompetent rather than criminally malicious, and we had to do it without explicitly admitting I committed appraisal fraud. We drove to the estate in silence. The grand iron gates were rusted in the open position. When we entered the house, the atmosphere was suffocating. Eleanor was sitting in the parlor, smoking a cigarette, a habit she had abandoned decades ago. Darcy was pacing the length of the faded oriental rug, talking frantically on her phone to a lawyer, who was clearly charging her by the minute. When Darcy saw me, she snapped her phone shut. She ran over and grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my coat. She demanded I call the police and tell them the appraisal was absolutely accurate. She insisted that if I just stood by my professional opinion, the fraud charges would evaporate. I pulled my arm away. I looked at my mother, who was staring at the unlit fireplace. I asked Eleanor if she remembered the conversation we had 12 years ago. I asked her if she remembered what I told her about the stone. Eleanor refused to meet my eyes. She said I had always been jealous of Darcy, that I was trying to ruin her business before it even started, and that the sapphire was our grandfather's pride. The delusion was absolute. She genuinely believed her own fiction. I left them in the parlor and walked down the hall to the library. The room was freezing. The walls were lined with rotting leather-bound books and filing cabinets filled with decades of unpaid invoices, tax extensions, and municipal warnings. If I was going to save myself from federal prison, I could not rely on my mother's sudden grip on reality. I had to find external proof that the stone was a known replica, long before I ever put it under a microscope. Yasmin helped me pull the heavy drawers open. We were looking for anything from 1928 to 1932, the years surrounding the Great Depression. We spent 4 hours sifting through moth-eaten receipts for coal deliveries, letters from boarding schools and property deeds. My fingers were black with dust. My back ached. It was near midnight when Yasmin pulled a thin, brittle manila envelope from the back of a drawer, labeled with our grandfather's initials. Inside was a series of correspondences with a jeweler in Paris named Henri Chastain. I carefully unfolded the fragile paper. The first letter, dated October 1930, was a desperate plea from my grandfather, asking Chastain to facilitate the private sale of a natural blue sapphire pendant. The second document was a bill of sale, confirming the transaction. The real Vance sapphire had been sold to a Belgian industrialist for a sum that likely saved the estate from the bank. The third piece of paper was the one that made my chest tight. It was an invoice from Chastain, dated 3 months later. It was a bill for the creation of a replica, explicitly detailing the use of synthetic spinel and the recycling of the original platinum setting to ensure the piece felt authentic to the touch. I held the paper up to the desk lamp. Here it was, the institutional memory of the family's decline, a secret kept by my grandfather, maintained by my mother's willful ignorance, and finally weaponized by my sister's greed. The next morning, Yasmin and I walked back into the municipal building. We were directed to a larger conference room. Tobias was there, along with an assistant district attorney and a sharply dressed lawyer representing the federal receiver, handling the collapsed private equity firm. Eleanor and Darcy arrived 10 minutes later, looking exhausted and defensive. The assistant district attorney started the meeting. He stated that they had seized the physical necklace from the lenders. Their own gemologists had examined it. They knew it was synthetic. He looked directly at me and said they were preparing charges for accessory to wire fraud, pending my explanation of the 12-year-old appraisal. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I opened my briefcase and placed the fragile 1930 documents on the center of the table. I slid them toward the prosecutor. I explained that my grandfather had sold the original stone in 1930 and commissioned a replica. I stated that for 90 years, the Vance family had genuinely believed the replica was the original, as the knowledge of the sale died with my grandfather. I said that when I examined the piece 12 years ago, I was a junior appraiser, using inferior equipment, and was heavily influenced by the provenance documents my family provided. I admitted to professional negligence, to a failure of rigorous testing, but I absolutely denied intentional fraud. I then pointed out that because Darcy and Eleanor genuinely believed the item was authentic, They lacked the mens rea, the criminal intent, required for a wire fraud conviction. They were guilty of arrogance and financial stupidity, but not deliberate deception. The prosecutor read the French invoice. He passed it to Tobias, who inspected the date and the signature. The room was terribly quiet. Darcy looked at the papers, then at me, her face contorted in a mix of relief and profound humiliation. The realization that she had staked her entire future, her freedom, and her pride on a piece of glass was settling over her like physical weight. Eleanor did not look at the papers. She stared out the window at the parking lot, her posture rigid, her hands trembling in her lap. The central myth of her life had just been dismantled on a municipal conference table. The federal lawyer cleared his throat. He stated that while the criminal fraud charges against Darcy might not hold up against this historical evidence of mutual mistake, the fact remained that the primary collateral for the loan was worthless. Therefore, the lender, and by extension the federal government, was immediately executing the lien on the secondary collateral. They were foreclosing on the estate. The grace periods were over. The extensions were void. Eleanor and Darcy had 30 days to vacate the property. Darcy started to cry. It was a loud, ugly sound. She looked at Eleanor, waiting for her mother to do what she always did: find a loophole, make a phone call, summon some hidden reserve of privilege. But Eleanor simply stood up, pulled her coat tightly around her shoulders, and walked out of the room without saying a word. Tobias looked at me. He gathered the documents, placed them back in the folder, and told me I was free to go. He advised me quietly to perhaps consider a different line of work. I walked out of the building with Yasmin. The coastal wind was cutting through my jacket, carrying the smell of salt and dying leaves. The consequences moved swiftly over the next few weeks. The estate was seized. The bank auctioned off the antique furniture, the silver, and the books to cover the remaining debts. Darcy moved into a cramped apartment in Boston, taking a job managing a retail clothing store. Eleanor moved into a small assisted living facility on the edge of town, funded by whatever was left after the liquidation. She refused to speak to me, which I accepted as a necessary casualty of the truth. As for me, I did not wait for the State Appraisal Board to review my file. I voluntarily surrendered my certification. I sold my shares in Oakhaven Antiquities to Yasmin, who rebranded the firm and continued to thrive. I spent a month packing up my small apartment. I sold most of my belongings, keeping only a few books, my winter coats, and a small box of personal papers. Among those papers was the 1930 invoice from Henri Chastain. I kept it not as a souvenir of victory, but as a reminder of the exact price of maintaining an illusion. On my final morning in town, I walked down to the harbour. The tide was out, exposing the jagged rocks and the grey mud. The water was cold and restless. I took the French invoice out of my pocket. I looked at the faded ink, the elegant handwriting detailing the creation of a fake legacy designed to impress people who did not care. I didn't tear it up. I didn't throw it into the ocean in a dramatic gesture of closure. I simply folded it in half, put it back in my pocket, and turned away from the water. I had a train to catch, and for the first time in my life I had absolutely nothing left to protect. I was sitting on the wooden bench of the regional rail station, my single suitcase resting against my knee, watching the departure board flip its mechanical letters. I had exactly 14 minutes before the northbound train would take me away from the wreckage of my family. That was when Yasmin's car hopped the curb outside the station, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. She left the engine running, pushed through the heavy glass doors, and walked straight toward me. She didn't look like a woman who had just taken over a lucrative antiquities firm. She looked like someone who had spent the last 48 hours staring at spreadsheets until her eyes bled. She sat down next to me, ignoring my suitcase, and placed a thick stack of printed emails on my lap. She told me I couldn't get on the train. She said the federal receiver's rapid foreclosure on the estate didn't make sense. The timeline was too aggressive. The private equity firm was under investigation for predatory lending. Yes, but the speed at which they liquidated my mother's property was unprecedented, even for a corrupt institution. Yasmin had used her forensic accounting background to trace the corporate shell companies that had purchased the estate at the bank's closed auction. I looked down at the papers. The buyer was a limited liability corporation registered in Delaware, but the subsidiary managing the acquisition was a commercial real estate development group based in Boston. The same group, Yasmin pointed out, that had recently lobbied the local zoning board to reclassify the marshland surrounding my mother's property for high-density luxury condominiums. I told Yasmin that didn't matter anymore. The house was gone. My mother was in an assisted living facility and my sister was selling sweaters in a boutique. The trap had sprung and we were all on the outside. Yasmin shook her head. She pulled out a bank transfer record from the stack. She highlighted a wire transfer made 3 weeks before my birthday dinner. It was a payment of $50,000, categorized as a consulting advance, sent from the real estate development group to a newly formed wellness startup. The startup was registered to Darcy. The cold air in the station suddenly felt heavy in my lungs. I read the transfer details twice, trying to find a clerical error, a misunderstanding, anything that didn't lead to the conclusion forming in my mind. Darcy hadn't been a victim of her own delusion. She hadn't accidentally defrauded a predatory lending company. She had orchestrated the entire collapse. Yasmin laid it out with brutal clarity. Darcy knew the estate was sitting on prime developmental land, but Eleanor would never sell. Eleanor would rather die in that rotting Victorian house than see it bulldozed. Darcy also knew about the fake sapphire. She must have taken it to another appraiser years ago, secretly, and learned the truth. But she also knew about my forged appraisal from 12 years ago, sitting in the floor safe. So Darcy made a deal with the developers. They pointed her toward the corrupt private equity firm, a lender known for accepting high-risk collateral without doing immediate due diligence. Darcy used my fake appraisal to secure the loan, fully aware that the federal authorities were already circling the firm. She deliberately triggered the default, knowing the government would seize the house and auction it off quickly to satisfy the debts, allowing the developers to swoop in and buy it at a fraction of its future value. The $50,000 was her advance. She traded our mother's home and nearly traded my freedom for a cut of the real estate deal. I stood up, leaving my suitcase by the bench. The train arrived on the platform, the doors sliding open with a hiss of pneumatic pressure. I watched the few passengers board, then watched the doors close. The train pulled away, leaving the station quiet again. I told Yasmin we needed to pay a visit to Boston. We drove straight from the station to the address listed on Darcy's new apartment lease. It was not a cramped studio in a bad neighborhood, as she had led the family to believe. It was a newly renovated loft in the Seaport district, the kind of place that required first, last, and a substantial security deposit. I bypassed the intercom, waiting for a resident to leave the building, and slipped through the heavy glass doors. Yasmin followed closely behind. We took the elevator to the 4th floor and walked down the hallway, the thick carpet silencing our footsteps. I knocked on door 402. It took a minute, but the door unlocked and swung open. Darcy stood there wearing expensive silk loungewear, holding a cup of espresso. When she saw me, the color completely drained from her face. She tried to close the door, but I stepped forward, wedging my shoulder against the frame, and pushed my way inside. The apartment was immaculate. It smelled of expensive candles and new leather. There were architectural blueprints spread across the kitchen island. I walked over to the island and looked down at the documents. They were site plans for a luxury condominium complex. The title block in the corner read, Oakhaven Marsh Development. I turned to my sister. I didn't yell. I didn't demand an apology. I simply placed the printed wire transfer record next to her blueprints. I asked her how long she had known the sapphire was glass. Darcy looked at the paper, then at Yasmin, and finally at me. The panicked, victimized facade she had worn at the police station was gone. Her posture straightened, and her expression hardened into something incredibly cold and calculating. She walked over to the espresso machine and carefully set her cup down. She told me she had known for 5 years. She had taken the stone to a gemologist in New York while Eleanor was on vacation. When the jeweler laughed at her, she realized the only thing holding the family hostage to that crumbling estate was our mother's pathetic pride. She said I was a coward for writing the fake appraisal, and she merely used my cowardice as leverage to finally free up the family's assets. She argued that she had done us a favor. She said the developers were going to pay her a finder's fee of $500,000 once the zoning went through, and she generously offered to send a portion of it to help cover Eleanor's care facility. She spoke about the destruction of our family as if it were a successful corporate merger. I asked her if she realized what would have happened to me if I hadn't found our grandfather's receipt from 1930. I asked her if she cared that the federal prosecutor was hours away from indicting me for wire fraud. Darcy looked at me with genuine indifference. She said that collateral damage was unavoidable in business, and that I always managed to land on my feet anyway. Yasmin stepped forward, pulling her phone from her pocket. She pressed a button and set it on the kitchen island. The screen showed an active recording app. Yasmin informed Darcy that Massachusetts is a two-party consent state for recording conversations, which is why she was explicitly stating, on the record, that she was recording. Darcy scoffed. She said a recording of her admitting to a real estate deal wasn't illegal. She hadn't committed a crime by introducing buyers to a distressed property. I told her she was right. The real estate deal wasn't a crime, but intentionally submitting a fraudulent document to a federally insured financial institution across state lines, knowing the document was false, was federal wire fraud. By admitting she knew the stone was fake 5 years ago, she had just confessed to the very crime she had blamed on mutual ignorance at the police station. She had just provided the criminal intent the prosecutor had been looking for. The silence in the apartment was absolute. The soft hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded like a jet engine. Darcy looked at the phone on the counter, her eyes wide, the reality of her arrogant confession finally breaking through her armor. She reached for the device, but Yasmin's hand shot out, grabbing it first and slipping it back into her pocket. I told Darcy she had exactly 24 hours to contact Detective Tobias and the assistant district attorney. I told her she was going to turn over every email, every wire transfer, and every blueprint connecting her to the developers. If she cooperated, they might let her plead down. If she didn't, Yasmin and I would walk the recording directly to the federal building. I didn't wait for her response. I turned around and walked out of the apartment, leaving the door wide open behind me. The 24 hours passed with an agonizing slowness. I spent them sitting in a budget motel room near the interstate, watching the headlights of passing trucks illuminate the cheap stucco ceiling. Yasmin had gone back to our office to prepare for the inevitable audits, leaving me alone with the silence. At dawn, my phone finally rang. It was Detective Tobias. Darcy had not waited for the deadline to expire. Sometime during the night, her self-preservation had overridden her arrogance. She had walked into the federal building with her laptop, a hard drive and her lawyer, and she had begun to talk. The fallout was clinical, bureaucratic, and utterly devoid of the dramatic justice one might expect from a family betrayal. The federal authorities did not care about broken sisterhood or a mother's crushed delusions. They cared about the paper trail. Darcy provided the emails, the wire transfer records, and the development blueprints. By noon, the commercial real estate group was raided, and their zoning applications were immediately frozen by the city council. The private equity firm, already bleeding from the initial investigation, collapsed entirely under the weight of the new conspiracy charges. Darcy, having provided the central evidence against the developers, secured a plea deal. She avoided a federal penitentiary, but was stripped of her finder's fee, hit with staggering financial penalties, and confined to her Boston loft under house arrest for the foreseeable future. Despite the unraveling of the scheme, the estate was not saved. The revelation of the fraud did not magically erase a decade of unpaid property taxes, structural decay, and delinquent utility bills. The bank retained ownership of the property. Because the luxury condominium project was now tied up in endless federal litigation, the Victorian house simply sat empty on the marshland, slowly sinking further into the mud, waiting for a wrecking ball that would not arrive for years. I visited Eleanor one last time before leaving the state. The assisted living facility on the edge of town smelled strongly of industrial bleach and overcooked vegetables. It was a clean, well-lit, profoundly depressing place. I found my mother sitting in a vinyl recliner in the recreation room, watching a muted television screen. The aristocratic posture was completely gone. She looked small, fragile, and older than I had ever seen her. I pulled up a plastic chair and sat beside her. I didn't apologize and I didn't ask for her forgiveness, because neither of us had anything left to offer the other. She turned her head, looked at me with eyes that were entirely vacant, and asked the nursing assistant to wheel her back to her room. She never said a word to me. I accepted the silence, left a box of her favorite Earl Grey tea on the reception desk, and walked out the automatic sliding doors. I did not return to the appraisal business. The entire industry of valuations, of attaching inflated monetary worth to inherited vanity, held absolutely no appeal to me anymore. I formally signed over my remaining equity in Oakhaven to Yasmin, who rebranded the firm under her own name and quickly distanced the business from the scandal. With the modest buyout money, I packed my single suitcase and drove north, leaving the coastal Massachusetts town and its suffocating social currency far behind me. I took a job as an archiving specialist at a small maritime museum in Maine. The salary was a fraction of what I used to make, but the work required only the meticulous verification of the truth. I spent my days restoring actual history, preserving shipmaster logs, documenting authentic navigation tools, and protecting fragile records from the damp, salt air. There was no prestige in it, no wealthy clients demanding I alter reality to suit their pride, and for the first time in my adult life, I slept through the night without the low-grade hum of anxiety in my chest. It has been 6 months since the morning in the police station. My new apartment is a cramped, drafty room above a hardware store, heated by a cast-iron radiator that clanks violently when the boiler turns on. There is no peeling silk wallpaper here, no baccarat crystal, and no heavy floor safe hiding decades of lies. I was sitting at my small wooden kitchen table this morning, cataloguing a stack of 19th century harbor manifests for the museum. The leather-bound ledger was thick, and the pages kept trying to turn themselves over. I needed something sturdy to hold my place. I reached into my satchel and pulled out the 1930 invoice from Henri Chastain. I looked at the elegant French handwriting detailing the purchase of the synthetic sapphire, smoothed out the brittle folds one last time, and placed the paper flat against the spine of the ledger to weigh down the pages. I took a sip of my black coffee, listened to the distant sound of the harbor bells ringing down the street, and quietly went back to work.
The Vance family's 19-room Victorian estate was not just a home but the physical manifestation of a profound delusion. Social context: for decades, Eleanor Vance presided over this crumbling coastal Massachusetts property like a reigning monarch, ignoring the peeling silk wallpaper and sinking marshland, pretending structural decay was merely charming patina. Psychological Eleanor: within this social ecosystem, reputation was a currency that outlasted actual money, which the Vances had desperately lacked for generations. Their only surviving dignity, the physical pillar of their false history, was the massive Vance sapphire. As a precise technical analysis in the history of the family reveal, this cornerstone of identity was a pure fabrication, an illusion. Their grandfather, facing financial collapse during the Great Depression, quietly sold the genuine, natural sapphire to a Belgian industrialist in 1930. Desperate to save face, he commissioned a mathematical perfect synthetic replica using the Verneuil process from a jeweler in Paris, Henri Chastain. This single, secret act anchored nearly a century of deception. Eleanor Vance, in an act of powerful psychological negation and rewriting of reality, spent a decade convincing herself the lie was true. When the eldest daughter, an expert appraiser, confronted her mother with scientific proof of the stone's synthetic nature and its creation from a synthetic spinel, Eleanor simply erased the reality, accusing the narrator of jealousy. This forced the pragmatist narrator into a tactical silence, an exhaustion from managing the family's incessant financial crises leading to a fateful compromise, a false appraisal intended to secure credit for the family home. The power of this shared lie was the family's tool to survive humiliation. Years later, this private self-deception collided with ruthless corporate calculation. The visionary sister, Darcy, orchestrated a complex property collapse based on her secret 5-year knowledge of the fake stone. She maneuvered the estate into a seizure by a federally scrutinized private equity firm, intending to let developers swoop in and buy the valuable marshland for luxury condominiums in exchange for a massive finder's fee. Darcy's sociopathic manipulation nearly traded her sister's freedom for a cut of the real estate deal, a betrayal of unparalleled proportions. The consequences were swift and total. A federal investigation into the corrupt private equity firm triggered raids, leading to charges of federal wire fraud and money laundering due to the inflated collateral across state lines. Darcy's gamble collapsed. The narrator and her partner, Yasmin, used forensic accounting and historical research to find the only thing that could save them, the original 1930 invoice from Chastain, proving the stone was a known replica decades before any recent assessment. The discovery dismantled the family's entire myth. The narrator confronted Darcy and recorded her arrogant confession, which was used to force Darcy into cooperation with the authorities. The final impact was clinical. Darcy avoided prison through a plea deal but was stripped of all wealth and placed under house arrest. Eleanor, her main delusion shattered on a municipal conference table, withdrew into a vacant state at an assisted living facility. The grand Victorian house sat empty, awaiting the inevitable wrecking ball that federal litigation delayed. The narrator, in an act of final accountability, surrendered her certification and began a new life as a maritime archivist in Maine, finding peace in preserving verifiable, authentic history. The saga demonstrates that the price of maintaining an illusion is devastating, verification is vital, and the ultimate truth of a legacy will inevitably emerge.